Hello everyone, let me move this. This is part 2, Lay and Grant, We're the Adversaries. This is by the People Profiles. Just ended with the greatest line, which is Robert E. Lee saying, slavery is the worst thing in the world. Let's continue.
It is useless to expatiate on its disadvantages. I think it, however, a greater evil to the white man than to the black race. And while my feelings are strongly enlisted on behalf of the latter, my sympathies are more strong for the former. Although Lee expressed disapproval of the institution of slavery, he still held the common view in the latter half of his letter that, quote, "the blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa."
And that's a common theme from a lot of people in the South at that time. So it's, and I think people at the North probably thought that was garbage. That's a lie. But if they're free, I don't want them living next to me. So, they still harbored racism in the North. At which, at the time, I think world around, it was, slavery, racism, just common.
Morally, socially, and physically, the painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise and merciful providence. Lee held a young, moderate Southern gentleman's view on slavery. While he agreed that slavery was immoral, he believed that the problem of slavery would be handled by God in his time, and it was not the responsibility of politicians or slave owners to answer the question. While Lee's approach was more of inaction towards the institution, despite his objection to it, others would take a different approach. Henry Clay.
We have laws that are written by men. Men need to write and change laws. And by men, I mean, at the time, men. Women now, too. But laws are enacted because of people. I've never sat around going, when's God going to settle this whole Second Amendment dispute that I keep hearing about? Is God going to come and take my guns? Never crossed my mind. So it's easy to say that because now you're just passing the buck to someone else. Oh, no, it'll be resolved by the Lord in my day. Nah.
John Randolph and Richard Bland founded the American Colonization Society to sponsor the creation of Liberia to send free blacks back to Africa. In order to satisfy slave owners, they were to be compensated for the loss of their slaves.
Once you take a slave, take a person, you enslave them, and they start a family. When you have multiple generations, you're no longer sending them back to Africa. Their life is here now. Now, if they want to try to go back, that's fine, they can. But they don't know what they're going back to, especially if they've been here for 10, 15, 20 years. What do you think is holding out for you there? Not, I'm not trying to sound mean, but if you've just up and vanished, your loved ones, yeah, they might be looking for you and stuff like that, but it's just, their hope is just diminished. I guess diminished. They don't expect you, and they themselves also have to go through the whole grieving process and move on. Yes, they would probably love to have you there, but when you go back, you're not stepping back into the situation as it was when you left. If you had a wife there, she could be dead. She could have moved on, not out of disrespect towards you, but just you've been gone. And going back would be such a hard thing because they don't necessarily know what it is they would be going back to. It could have been peace, now it's a civil war. It's just it's a tough. Once you've committed to taking them and you bring them here, and you start giving them families because you're going to use those kids. If the mother's a slave, as the rule of thumb was, if the mother's a slave, the kids are slaves. So you're just kind of keeping this thing going. Well, why would that person want to leave? They would want to be free here to get their kids and maybe their wife free. Yeah. Once you've kind of, how do you phrase it? I don't really know how I'm thinking of phrasing it, but it's pretty much like, once you've opened that container, this chair, once you've opened it, you're stuck with it.
Ultimately, the Liberia plan failed in its initial goal, and as tensions rose, it was written off as a slaveholder's scheme. The politics at Fort Monroe continued, and despite Lee's low rank, he always seemed to have more influence than senior officers, such as Colonel Eustis. This is believed to be because General Gratiot, the chief of the Corps of Engineers, had more political sway in Washington, D.C. over the chief of artillery. Lee would lead the project to extend and reinforce a 15-acre artificial island, which would eventually become Fort Wool. This new fort would be used to support and defend Fort Monroe with crossfire at enemy vessels. Though the work was steady, he gained no joy from it and began to doubt his choice to join the military. The new soldiers who arrived at Fort Monroe brought new social life, primarily in the form of drinking, although Lee would abstain for the most part, and never understood the obsession with getting drunk. Unlike many of his fellow young officers, he was never seen as being stuffy and was considered to be great company to be around. He kept his distance from his peers and was a reserved man. Mary would visit Lee at Fort Monroe in June of 1832, and it would be during this time that the couple would announce the impending arrival of their first child. The Lee's first child would be George Washington Custis Lee, who was named after his grandfather, George Washington's adopted son. Mary would spend much of her time raising him at Arlington. Between 1832 and 1834, Lee would essentially take charge of the engineers at Fort Monroe from his friend and superior, Captain Tulcott, who was frequently absent. Yet his time would be short at Fort Monroe, as in 1834, Lee would be transferred to Washington, D.C. to the War Department. Lee found the office work at the War Department to be monotonous, with the chances of being promoted relatively slim, while the pay was even worse. But he would enjoy the birth of his first daughter, Mary Custis Lee, in 1835. During this time, General Gratiot hardly visited the project sites, leaving Lee in charge of overseeing their progress. He was bound by endless red tape and would only be saved from the paperwork when he was dispatched to assist his old friend Captain Tulcott in the Midwest Territories in 1835. In the state of Ohio and the territory of Michigan, fighting broke out over a small section of land known as the Toledo Strip. The Toledo Strip spanned 500 square miles and included the important port of Toledo. This conflict would eventually result in the Toledo War, which was little more than a brief skirmish, as the only injury was a Michigan deputy who was stabbed by a boy with a penknife. During the dispute, Captain Tulcott and Lieutenant Lee surveyed the area to better determine the boundaries of Ohio and Michigan, and ultimately, Michigan lost the Toledo Strip to Ohio, but in return, it received the Upper Peninsula, which would be the cause of the rivalry between Ohio and Michigan. Following his surveying of the Ohio and Michigan border, Lee was dispatched in 1837 to St. Louis to solve a major problem. The Mississippi River was cutting a new channel that threatened the port that brought trade to St. Louis, and Lee was the only suitable candidate to tackle the assignment. The port of St. Louis was an important transportation site, as many Americans who traveled west to California and Oregon would meet there, and should Lee fail, westward expansion might come to a complete halt. Lee had two objectives: save the port and waterfront, and remove as many trees as possible from a 200-mile stretch of the Mississippi River along the Missouri-Iowa border. The technology of navigational engineering was still in its infancy during Lee's time in St. Louis, and Lee needed to find a way to curb the river's natural will to change direction. The Corps of Engineers had dumped tons of boxed sand around Bloody Island in order to push the current towards St. Louis and away from the new channel. But the boxes were smashed, which only worsened the situation by increasing the bar. After the wooden boxes failed, they tried using teams of oxen to dredge up the sand, yet that attempt too would ultimately fail. The river was not impossible to tame, as Lee had learned many lessons and knew that he must create barriers that were strong enough to channel the current that would also create resistance to destroy the dikes. Lee reflected back to his days at West Point, specifically a French textbook on hydrodynamics, and used that as his inspiration for the project. The original idea was to use the undergrowth to snag debris that floated down the Mississippi River. The Lees had their third child on the 31st of May 1837, this time a boy, William Fitzhugh Lee. Despite being overjoyed at the newest addition to the family, the pay Lee was receiving in the army was slowly lessening his ability to take care of his family properly. But Lee's work in St. Louis did not go unnoticed, and in July of 1838 he was promoted to the rank of captain. In the summer of 1839, on the 18th of June, the Lees welcomed their fourth child, Anne Carter Lee, to the family. However, his work in St. Louis would be stopped by angry Illinois citizens who opened fire on his workers with cannons, out of fear that the progress Lee was making would cut them out of the increasingly lucrative trading along the Mississippi River. The Illinois citizens had hoped to prevent the growth of St. Louis in order to force trade through their city, and an injunction was issued by the Second Illinois Circuit, halting all work on Bloody Island. Lee had worked hard to improve the conditions along the Mississippi, but by the summer of 1840, he returned to St. Louis to finalize the affairs of the army by selling the equipment it had purchased for the work. Lee was then reassigned to New York City to oversee the reconstruction of Forts Hamilton and Lafayette, along with the battery positions on Staten Island. The restoration of these fortifications was vitally important, as the only major threat to American authority was Great Britain, as they were the only nation who had the means to bring the fight to American shores. Yet, before his arrival in New York, the Lees had their fifth child, Eleanor Agnes Lee, on the 27th of February 1841. His duties in New York were deemed significant enough to encourage his family to move with him, yet Mary and his children would not join him right away. Mary's unwillingness to move to New York at first was criticized by many, as she would have been expected to go wherever Lee went. Yet in her defense, she had 5 children between 1832 and 1841, and
I was gonna say, I mean, up and moving with 5 young kids to New York, where it's, you know, probably the busiest city. Yeah, I can understand not wanting to do that. Come from the South, where everything's probably a little easier, slower, relaxed. And now you're going up to chaos, people going everywhere. Yeah, I would get it.
Suffered from arthritis and general poor health. Mary would join Lee in New York in the spring of 1843, but would leave shortly after when she found out she was pregnant with their 6th child, Robert E. Lee Jr., on the 27th of October, 1843. But Lee was still in New York, focusing on the forts. Although Lee was a skilled engineer, he had very few other accomplishments which would bring him the attention he deserved. However, he did have one highlight on his resume. Lee was named as a member of the Board of Examiners at West Point in 1844. He would spend 2 weeks at West Point overseeing and judging the final exams of the cadets, along with Major General Winfield Scott, the commanding officer of the U.S. Army.
I think that's probably of all the pictures I've ever seen of Winfield Scott, I think that's probably the biggest smile I've ever seen. He just looked like a grumpy guy.
Who formed a positive opinion of Lee during the time they spent together. Scott was a large, towering figure of the day, also a hero from the War of 1812, with the nickname Old Fuss and Feathers. Lee was never the type of person to use flattery to advance himself, like many other officers, although this would never have worked on General Winfield Scott, as he was known to soak up flattery like a sponge. So Lee used his intelligence instead to impress him. The impression Lee made on General Winfield Scott gave him some advantages, as from 1844 to 1846 he acted as a congressional liaison for the Chief of Engineering while simultaneously working in New York. He was also appointed to be a member of the Board of Engineers for the Atlantic Coast Defense, and during this time, in early 1846, Mary gave birth to the Lee's final child, Mildred Child, who was affectionately called Millie by Lee. The action which Lee was seeking would eventually happen when events out west began to heat up. Mexico and the United States were trying to establish hegemony over the West as the territory was increasing in population density. The origin of the disputes go back to 1810, when Moses Austin was granted land in Texas by the Mexican government. The Mexican government hoped the American settlers would provide a buffer between the raids of the Comanche tribe and the Mexican citizens. Instead, the Americans overwhelmed the Mexican government, who did not have the administrative or military ability to keep them in line. The ineffectiveness of the Mexican government to corral the American citizens would result in the overthrow of the government by General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna.
I didn't realize Santa Anna lived quite the long life into his 80s. Wow.
Who was nicknamed the Napoleon of the West. He would both threaten to take military action on the American settlers and offer to sell them more land. General Santa Anna made good on his threats and attacked the Texan-held mission called the Alamo. From the 23rd of February to the 5th of March in 1836, the 100-men garrison held off the 1,500-strong Mexican army, but the Alamo fell on the 6th of March. The women and children of the mission were allowed to leave, but the men were slaughtered at the site, leading to the famous battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," which stirred the American public into a frenzy. Following the massacre at the Alamo, the Texans routed the Mexicans at the Battle of San Jacinto, which forced Mexico to recognize Texan independence. 10 years later, Texas would be annexed by the United States in 1845. Mexico was outraged at the annexation of Texas, while the northern states were irate at the addition of another slave state into the Union. Mexico broke off its diplomatic relations, yet President James Polk wished to maintain diplomatic relations in order to purchase California and New Mexico. Mexico continued to experience political instability, as the Mexican presidency changed 4 times, the Ministry of War 6 times, and the Finance Ministry 16 times. Despite this instability, if there was anything that could unite the Mexican people, it was their hatred for losing Texas to the Americans. The border between the United States and Mexico was disputed, as Mexico believed the border was along the Nueces River, while the United States believed the border lay along the Rio Grande. As a result, President Polk sent Brigadier General Zachary Taylor to occupy the land, but they were attacked by a Mexican cavalry unit, killing 16 Americans. The Thornton Affair, as it became known, gave the American government the cause to attack Mexico, as Polk argued to Congress that American blood has been shed upon American soil. In response, General Taylor moved swiftly against the Mexican army, defeating them twice at Palo Alto and then at Resaca de la Palma. The Americans outclassed the Mexican army with its advanced weapons, which included the speedily deployed horse artillery and the Colt revolver. The outbreak of the Mexican War gave Lee the opportunity he was looking for to better his rank in the military, and on the 19th of August 1846 he would be dispatched to San Antonio de Bexar, Texas, to report to Brigadier General John E. Wool. General Wool and Captain Lee were stopped along the Rio Grande when a Mexican officer appeared with a flag of truce, reporting that General Taylor had defeated a Mexican army at the Battle of Monterrey. Apparently, General Taylor had accepted an 8-week armistice in return for its surrender. This armistice, as Lee and others speculated, only served as a barrier to allow Santa Anna to recruit and train new soldiers to fight against the Americans, and on the night of the 18th of November, news reached camp that the armistice had been cancelled by President Polk to the relief of Lee and the other soldiers.
I'm going to stop it here. We just got to remember that an armistice was just canceled and they're going back into it. And I know Polk, I've been to his ancestral home because the Polk the actual Polk home was destroyed. I think it was a fire or something. But he left office. I think he died like 4 months after he left. He was a hard-working guy when he was the president. He did not. He believed that he would rest after he was done. He never got the chance. So I'm going to end this here. This is part 2. We're going to get into part 3. It looks like it's just going to be all about Lee right now, which is fine. Let's learn about him. So until the next video, like and subscribe, or you're going to get anal malaria.